Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And my original plan was to do this episode as a replacement for covering Kanye West and Drake. And then I discovered that I could effectively kill two birds with one stone with those reviews in particular, and I'd be stuck covering them on Billboard Breakdown anyway. But then I also realized I had enough projects to pull this together anyway, so alright, what the hell, screw it. All country episode of On the Pulse. So we got 6 albums on the docket. Let's start off with, from Mike and the Moonpies, One to Grow Up.
One thing leads to another, then another, and another one.
You know, I was really high on that last album, Cheap Silver and Solid Country Gold, and so were a lot of the indie country critics that heard it. But the more I think about Mike and the Moonpies, the more I wonder why they don't always grip me as deeply as I might like. Yeah, the production's often melodic and rich, and the writing is deceptively great, and reportedly they're fantastic live. So why can't I escape the feeling that I'm praising an extremely solid neo-traditional act rather than one that will actually take a bigger swing, which was their biggest selling point of that last album? Well, regardless, they put out another project, and once again, it's getting rave reviews from the indie country set. And you know what? It's solid for what it is. Generally bouncy and melodic neo-traditional country with plentiful lead work careening off the pedal steel and the solid grooves that keeps a brisk clip without a serious issue in their production to speak of. But again, I'm wondering why this doesn't grip me as deeply as it could, why I don't love this, why does it take that next step, and I think I've got more of a handle on it now. For one, their frontman, Mike Harmler, he's got a good voice, but not a super distinctive presence. His vocal timbre can feel a little bit thin, especially given how he's often placed a shade further back in the mix, which probably remains my most consistent issue with this band's production, where it also feels like the low end is just a little bit neglected. There's also something about a lot of their compositions that showcase a lot of their bar band roots, where you can tell they wrote a lot of these tracks with that free-flowing structure that will kill live whenever they want a plentiful solo to jam out, but it also means that the hooks aren't quite as tight and strong as they could be, and that doesn't always help the band leap off the page on record in the same way, especially if you know or grow up with a lot of their influences, like I did. Now granted, I'm not sure it helps that so many of their songs circle that same workaday territory too, which is why the tracks I like the most show them venturing away from some of that. I like how Hour on the Hour plays into the same post-heartbreak melancholy Scotty McCreery nailed with Feel Good Summer Song, and Brother is a pretty cool story, where he's facing mixed emotions trying to reconcile with a prodigal sibling now that they've struck oil on their land that compositionally reminds you a little bit of El Dorado by Randy Rogers and Wade Bowen, which again, absolutely a major compliment here. And when you pair it with the swaggering Rainy Day and The Vein, along with a slice of barroom longing of social drinkers, cuts that might feel like conventional Mike and the Moonpies songs, but wind up pretty damn great all the same, and the fact that this album gets in and out without landing a single miss, I mean, it's incredibly easy for me to like it for what it is. But it also feels like they're content with a slightly lower ceiling than I know they're capable, especially given all the risks that they did take with Cheap Silver and Solid Country Gold. And thus for me, extremely light 8 out of 10. It's way too well constructed for me to dismiss it, and there's enough legit great songs to nudge this up, but if you want them to take that next big step, even if this is fun, it's not that. Next up, from Jason Eady, To the Passage of Time.
For a second, he wasn't quite sure what it was, till it tickled his face and he opened his eyes on a beach in the French summer sun.
I bet there are some of you longtime fans who might be a little bit surprised this isn't getting a solo review. After all, I've been on the record that when it comes to this brand of stripped back, primarily acoustic country, Jason Eady's one of the best of the 2010s, and I stand by that. Well, with this project here, coming out of a lot of lockdown work he put up on Patreon last year, and his 2018 album, well, here's the thing. Jason Eady's formula is so rock solid with such a high floor that it can be kind of difficult to contextualize why an album might not have the same impact as his very best. So you wind up having to drill into the subtlest of details, because Of course the mix is warm and balanced and very approachable in this brand of minimalism. The bass grooves provide some great foundation, the mandolin, the strings, and the pedal steel allow for a ton of texture, and as a singer, Jason Eady has always been about those little restraints that come with age and maturity, and as most of the album plays back to slower tempos, it fits a lot closer to his self-titled album, and that's a compliment. And yet, why am I stuck with the feeling this doesn't quite have the gut punch of that project, or of my personal favorite of his, Daylight and Dark? Well, some of it might be linked to a feeling of comfort in the writing. With his wife Courtney Patton alongside him, he sounds a lot more settled and content. And given how sharp her delivery can be alongside his, I do wonder if it might have been a misstep to not utilize her more as a counterweight in his lyrics or any dramatic storytelling. But I think the issue is that any sense of greater drama in the storytelling is a little bit limited. Even beyond the road stories of Daylight and Dark, there tended to be a spiritual weight in trying to be a better man despite hard living across the self-titled and Daylight and Dark that feels a little less present here. Jason Eady has described this project as a bit of a follow-through on I Travel On, and I do hear some of it in his mature realizations of his agency and what he can't do, especially with so much in the world that has changed around him, and maybe he's got to grow and change too. But I wish I had a greater feel for the stakes beyond some of the broadly existential. French Summer Sun is highlighted as the centerpiece of the album in the open question of the generations that were lost in war and how he could have been one of them, but the reveal feels kind of slight in comparison with the quiet slow burn of, say, Saturday Night, where he's playing to a very sparse barroom crowd and he's just got to soldier on. And even then, as an artist, he at least has that luxury of leaning back and relaxing and dreaming, which is showcased in the prior song of that title, Luxury of Dreaming. But it is that sense of stakes that adds a little bit more of a personal touch to Jason Eady's storytelling, even if it is very low-key in the presentation. And hell, that's just part of his charm, just how lived in and focused it feels. And you know what? All that is still here. Again, this is exceptionally easy for me to like, which is why it's getting a light 8 out of 10. But for as lean and effective as this album is, gotta say it, to be with his best, needs a little more meat. Next up from Panopticon, And Again Into the Light. Okay, I was waiting for the lyrics to get formally released to cover this properly, but the album dropped in May, it's now September, and yeah, you know what, it's closer to country than a bunch of the stuff that mainstream Nashville plops out. It counts. Now, granted, in this case, I'd say that Austin Lund's palette of strings and acoustics is tilting a bit closer to folk this time around, and honestly, in this case specifically, I probably could have gotten away with covering this months ago and not needing the lyrics as much at all, basically because there's more of a structured arc to this album that doesn't really require a lot of writing to parse out. For one, it feels a lot more personal. Austin Lund has used black metal to find wild tranquility amidst the rage, but this time it feels like he's trying to confront his own depression and feelings of letting people down directly in recent years, and him barreling into pitch dark territory to do so with a lot more spacious, downbeat passages like on Dead Loons. He shows that despite his political ambitions that have manifested in his art, there needs to be some space for some vestige of self-care and caring for others. And when paired with the fractured clank of the acoustics on the wailing strings that sound as crisp as ever, you can tell that instead of the stark division of sounds on the 2018 double album, Austin Lund's trying to find more of a synthesis with some of those black metal elements, which is kind of awkward given how the production fidelity can only barely match them. This has been the greatest point of contention with this album for months now, and really what I've struggled with the most. The melodies, they're striking. The atmosphere's really potent. The drum work's legit fantastic, but if the bass is mixed into oblivion and the guitar melody has to claw through a level of murk that the other instruments don't have on an album that runs 70 minutes when the majority of the vocals can't even be made out, even if you gradually get used to this fusion in style, it just does not have the impact it could have in comparison with his early 2010s albums, which kind of got the formula and production better. And you know, It's frustrating because even if I can justify why this choice was done early on the project to showcase the mental struggle, and the guitar work's utterly wild, the lack of consistent mix balance, the less developed crescendos and a sense of dynamics, and any sense of real groove just keeps these songs from being as great as they should be, especially as you still get some really damn distinctive moments on practically every song, like the chunky riffage on Ropeburn Exit and No Hope, or the insane shredding on A Slowest Winter, or the bells backing up the punishing Moth-Eaten Soul. Yeah, the Embers at Dawn, probably my favorite, and it's probably got the most strikingly hopeful swell and crescendo on the entire project, even if it's absolutely playing to some post-rock textures for half the song. Deaf Heaven should take notes on how to do it well. But outside of that, despite all the heaviness I know in my gut should hit me so much harder, this one didn't quite click. I've had months with it, and I mostly blame the production here. Solid 7 out of 10. Let's hope this stylistic diversion was a one-time thing, and Panopticon can get back to being on top of the field. Cause I know they can. Next up from Lauren Alaina, Sitting Pretty on Top of the World.
We're in between. What do you think of when you think of me?
Okay, look, it's not all gonna be the indie stuff. Thought that would have been obvious. And besides, I've been on board with Lauren Alaina for a few years now for having better country instincts and solid songwriting chops, but not quite able to realize her crossover potential like, say, Kacey Ballerini, due to issues of label momentum and promotion and album construction. So even though the buzz on this seems to be kind of scant, I wanted to give it a real chance, and, well, it's a little odd. I feel like I'm gonna wind up praising this more than a lot of folks, but it's still not quite as good as I think it should be. But first, let's start with the major positives. Lauren Alaina has taken advantage of country pulling back towards some more neo-traditional tones by embracing more twang, more fiddle, more pedal steel, to say nothing of some predominantly organic percussion, which when you have such a huge and naturally expressive voice as Lauren Alaina does, it sets you up to play in similar territory as that absolutely fantastic pop country album from Lucy Hale back in 2014. Now, that's not saying there aren't some very obvious play for mainstream attention in the production and the writing. Most often the drum machines that slip in some programmed skitters and feel perpetually unnecessary, like on When the Party's Over, or the Trisha Yearwood collab Getting Good, or the clunky Getting Over Him with John Party. And I do have some other nitpicks with the album's pacing and sequencing again, which can feel really jerky and inconsistent, especially with a very loose post-breakup narrative that winds through a lot of the album before, what do you know, winding up in a relationship back at the end again. Like on her last album, she tacked on a bunch of songs from previous EPs from 2019 and 2020, and I would argue none of those songs really need to be here outside of maybe What Do You Think Of, the collab with Lucas Graham. Yeah, I'm actually serious with that one. Despite a pretty basic composition, the two of them have shockingly decent chemistry, and the melancholic longing and the lyrical detail actually kind of landed for me. But for all of this, it does have to circle back to the writing, which was her greatest hidden strength in 2017, and I'm just not sure it's gonna save her here outside of the co-writes from Laurie McKenna on Same Story, Different Saturday Night, and my personal favorite, I'm Not Sad Anymore. And you know what? I will say there are some nuggets of nuance that I do appreciate, like how If It Was Me, it highlights her lack of self-confidence was the real reason that the relationship fell apart, or her disgust for the preening of the good old boy, followed by You Ain't a Cowboy, even if she kind of gives herself an out here with On Top of the World, that funnily enough I actually really like in terms of the composition, but I also feel like a little bit more introspection or detail to painting the scene could have really fleshed this out, especially giving the lingering feeling that there's a lot of filler on this album's back half. Even if I do respect how the arc is ultimately more about her finding self-respect rather than just getting over this lost love. But even then, I'd struggle to say anything here stands out among her best from that last project, and while I appreciate the details that punch a bit above, a more focused and distinctive project would really do her good, maybe even break her through. So solid 6 out of 10. It is worth hearing, especially if you're a pop country fan, but again, I wanted to like this more. Next up from Sturgill Simpson, The Ballad of Dood and Juanita.
Up top, deep in the saddle hollering, whoa, 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 whoa.
Okay, at some point we're all just going to admit that Sturgill Simpson's just fucking with us, right? I mean, he's been on the record saying he was only going to cut 5 solo albums. I guess the Bluegrass cutting grass projects were just diversions last year, fair enough. But he's also wild enough to throw some real curveballs into the mix, especially with this coming after the careening genre and production nightmare that was Sound and Fury. Now keep in mind, I actually still like that album, and it does sound a fair bit better on vinyl, but I can also call a spade, especially in comparison with his first 3 projects. Now, in comparison, this was reportedly a narrative-driven concept album leaning way more heavily on traditional country and bluegrass. And you know, after a few listens to this, I am all the more convinced that this was cut so Sturgill Simpson could slip towards a band project, maybe longer term, that just occupies more interest, probably in bluegrass, or maybe even just retire, because this is a pretty abortive coda to the material he used to knock out of the park. The word I've seen in a lot of evaluations is rushed, but to me the words are rather underthought and kinda shallow, with a broadly sketched story of a couple where the woman's kidnapped by a bandit, the guy gets shot in pursuit and has to bury his dog along the chase, but then she's returned by an indigenous tribe where the bandit tried to trade her for a horse, and then after they went home, the protagonist goes off to shoot the bandit anyway. I mean, it's kind of frustrating that the story is so undercooked and broad because the detail in order to set the scene is here. There's a lot of twang and potent bluegrass frolic. The fiddles, they sound great. Willie Nelson, of all people, shows up to play guitar in a song. The mix is peppered with campfire crackles and gunfire. There's a few a cappella moments that I actually really liked. And Sturgill's vocal production might be the most stripped back and yet effective it's ever been. And you know, I guess you can make the argument that Sturgill Simpson was intentionally going for something more primitive, where the atmosphere fills in the gaps of a very archetypal story. But he's also not a stranger to doing a lot more interesting things with these archetypes, and if all that detail goes towards something that feels a little like glorified fan fiction, playing into the outlaw power fantasy rife with cliche, where only Dude is a real character at all on a project that runs less than a half hour, it just winds up feeling like a side venture, or more likely a project that was cut to get out of a record deal. And if Sound and Fury burned half of his bridges, this probably burns the other half. So, I'm gonna get pushback from this. 6 out of 10. I treat it as an extended side EP at best, and even then, not that good. But you know, while we're in controversy, finally from Kacey Musgraves, Starcross.
Deal with the fact that you should have treated me right, and I'm more than just a little justified.
Okay, look, if I didn't put her in this video, you wouldn't watch it. Granted, given just how much hype and momentum Kacey Musgraves had from Golden Hour, you might be excused for thinking this would get a solo review proper, especially as it's being framed as a divorce album from one of my favorite indie country acts in recent years, Ruston Kelly. Not only that, given some of the behind-the-scenes moves with her label, I had suspicions this was going to be about the furthest thing from country that she has ever made, so I was prepared to have a lot of complicated emotions going into this, especially as, while I do really like Golden Hour, let's be real, it doesn't come close to matching the best of Same Trailer, Different Park. And in this case, alright, let me start by saying I was really trying to get behind this one. Kacey Musgraves is an incredibly charismatic and expressive performer, even through all her most hazy and synthetic production to date. A lesser performer would likely have gotten lost in all the haze and the mist, and there's enough of a distinctive core just to her to pull you into this meandering breakup narrative. Bizarrely, the album that slipped in my mind wasn't any country or pop breakup album, but Beck's Sea Change. Not just some of the distinctly 2000s vibe to some of these compositions and production that we will get back to, but also in the listless, dreamlike fragmentation of the relationship where neither side was entirely in the right or the wrong in the framing. It just doesn't work out. And the haze is the distance you need, because otherwise, if you get too close, it's just too much. And given what Ruston Kelly has put on his own albums, being very honest about his demons, or the very telling melancholic undercurrents of Golden Hour that always seem to go overlook and seem to predict what was coming, the framing is very believable. And as a fan of both artists, I do appreciate the relative even-handedness of this framing, acknowledging Ruston Kelly's depression, self-sabotage, insecurity in the face of her success, who in parallel with Kacey Musgraves might have had a foot out the door instead of really trying to make it work, but it's also not remotely fair to expect her to be his caretaker and solve his problems, even if deep down she might have wanted to try and certainly seems to regret it when faced with the mess of being single. I get that. So yeah, even if I think that Rustin Kelly's made better music the past couple of years, I completely believe what Kacey Musgraves is presenting here, and I can bet he'd probably even agree with a lot of it too. So even if the language continues to feel more broad and basic compared to her early country material, which can lead to a few redundant moments here, it's still very credible. And I just really wish the actual music could rise to match it. This is her second album working with producers Ian Fitchuk and Daniel Tashian to lean into more of the acoustic back, synth-inflected haze. And I have to repeat with what I said on Golden Hour, the album loses momentum and really starts to drag. The blending just feels as inconsistent as hell, especially with the vocal leads. Please get Kacey Musgraves to work with Phineas. Someone needs to make that happen. It also feels melodically undercooked without more of a driving tune. It's got some of those 2000s affectations, and while her embrace of psychedelics has contributed to a very relaxed vibe, it just utterly breaks any sense of tension on the album, which even for a breakup as mature as this one should at least temper the tragedy, especially when the soft disco touches don't have anything close to the stronger hooks this time. So to summarize, this seems like an album that only seems to work if you're just riding the surface vibes. It's kind of like that last Lorde album in that regard. Or if you're a diehard fan who was invested in Kacey Musgraves' personal arc that, as of yet, still feels kind of inconclusive by the end of the album, where a lot of the imagery she's evoking in that film doesn't match the reality of this drama, which is much more small scale. And if you fall in between, or you don't have the emotional investment to care about both sides of the divorce drama, I'm just not sure there's enough here to satisfy in terms of the hooks, distinctive writing, or grooves. I don't consider it boring or an outright dud. The writing and delivery is still really damn good for what it is. And for what it's worth, some of the weirder synthetic layering, it's at least peculiar enough to hold my interest, even if it's haphazard when it works. But it is her weakest album to date. 7 out of 10. Again, I really wanted to like this more. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you would like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine I pissed off a lot of people with all this, but hey, look, there's a couple albums here I really wanted to love them, and if I had enough material to make solo reviews of them, I would, but with Kacey and Sturgill, I've seen them at their best, and I don't think these new projects are there. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, so I don't just have to do another all-country episode, link to my Patreon is right over there, where you can also get access to my Discord if you're curious. Once again, please don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand, but if you want to, options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and On the Pulse, and I'll see you next time.